ADHD is not a distinct disease like liver cancer or diabetes. It's a description of a set of behaviours. That's what Matt Walsh is saying. He suggests that ADHD isn't an actual disorder and that medicating kids is a lazy shortcut for parents who haven't actually tried everything. Is he right? Or is he completely missing the point? Today, I want to explore this head first. I'll break down exactly what ADHD is, why diagnoses have skyrocketed, and whether we're over-medicating kids. And if you're a parent of a hyperactive child wondering what to do, stick around because at the end, I'll be sharing some practical, evidence-based strategies to help kids with attention struggles without relying on medication. This debate is heated for a reason, so let's get into it. What is ADHD? Well, that depends on who you ask. According to Matt Walsh, ADHD isn't a real disorder at all.
The invention of ADHD and the mass prescribing of amphetamines to children in an effort to treat this completely contrived disease.
He acknowledges that kids, especially boys, show what psychiatrists call ADHD symptoms. In his view, these behaviours, being inattentive, hyperactive, struggling to sit still, aren't actually signs of a neurological condition. Instead, he believes that modern society has pathologised normal childhood behaviour and that kids are being unnecessarily medicated for what is essentially just boredom, immaturity, or a lack of discipline. And he's not the only one raising concerns. Dr Josef, a psychiatrist reacting to Walsh's comments, agrees that the diagnostic criteria for ADHD have expanded too much.
So originally, there are only a few conditions which people really needed to go and take medication for. These were things like severe psychosis and schizophrenia. And so we had this core of, legitimate psychiatric problems that are probably rooted in genetics. But over time, as the drugs had become a lot more profitable, it's just expanded. And now we're saying, mild depression and anxiety, children with inattentive problems or hyperactivity, these people have diseases now. And so it's gotten out of control. There's even adult ADHD.
He also suggests that our definition of ADHD might be more about societal expectations than an actual brain disorder.
What we've done in our profession is that when someone isn't suited to a specific environment, like that academic school type environment, instead of looking at them and saying, maybe this isn't the right fit for you, we say that they have a brain illness and, it's something that can be fixed with a medication.
So let's look at the definition of ADHD according to the medical community. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and it's classified as a neurodevelopmental disorder in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It has 3 subtypes. Inattentive type, which is difficulty focusing, forgetting things, struggling to follow instructions. The hyperactive impulsive type, which is fidgeting, talking excessively and acting without thinking, and a combined type, which is a mixture of both. The DSM-5 says that ADHD is a condition linked to differences in brain function, particularly in areas responsible for attention, impulse control, and executive function. The DSM outlines specific criteria for diagnosing ADHD, including persistent patterns of inattention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity, symptoms present for at least 6 months, symptoms interfering with functioning in at least 2 settings like school and home, symptoms beginning before the age of 12, symptoms not better explained by other mental disorders. It's important to add that research shows that there are biological differences between individuals with ADHD and those without. I think this is quite significant, actually. So often, mental disorders are identified by external signs, which opens the door for ambiguity. So personally, I like it when there's tangible science. Neuroimaging studies have identified structural differences in the ADHD brain, including a smaller prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia, as well as abnormalities in the frontal cortex, limbic system, and cerebellum. These are all areas involved in attention, impulse control, and executive function. Differences in dopamine and norepinephrine levels, genetic variations in neurotransmitter-related genes, and organic acid imbalances have all been linked to ADHD too. But as of yet, no single biomarker has been validated for clinical use. ADHD remains a highly heterogeneous condition, which means that no single test can definitively diagnose it. Neuroimaging and genetic testing are expensive and impractical for routine screening, and proposed biomarkers have yet to meet the required 80% sensitivity and specificity threshold for reliable diagnostic tools. So for now, ADHD is still diagnosed based on behaviour, not brain scans or lab tests. But as research moves forward, we might see a future where doctors can use biological markers to back up diagnoses, making them more accurate and even helping to tailor treatments to each person. ADHD has a few treatment options, the most common being stimulants with methylphenidate, like Ritalin, and amphetamines, Adderall, being the most popular. They work by increasing levels of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, which helps reduce symptoms of hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsivity. CBT and other behavioural therapies, especially for children, have been shown to be particularly effective when combined with medication. There are other treatments too, but these are the most typical. So let's get back to Matt Walsh. Is he right? Is ADHD overdiagnosed? Maybe. Are some kids getting medication when they don't need it? Probably. But does that mean that ADHD isn't real? That is a much bigger claim. What I want to know is why ADHD diagnoses have exploded in recent years. We'll get to that in a bit because that's where things get really, really interesting. Before that, let's talk about the numbers, because whether you agree with Matt Walsh or not, the rise in ADHD diagnoses and medication use is undeniable. Using data from 2022, according to the CDC, approximately 11.4% of US children aged 3 to 17 have been diagnosed with ADHD. That's over 7 million kids. And it's not just the kids. The number of adults diagnosed with ADHD has skyrocketed in the past 2 decades. According to Forbes Health in August 2023, more than 8.7 million adults in the US have been diagnosed with ADHD, with a significant increase since 2020. So what we can see is that ADHD diagnoses have surged over the years. More people than ever before are being told they have ADHD, and more people are taking medications for it. Approximately 3.3 million children, or roughly 5 out of every 100 children in the US, are currently prescribed medication for ADHD. Between the years 2000 and 2021, ADHD-related medication errors increased by 299%, according to a study published in the Pediatrics Journal. This translates to 1 medication error every 100 minutes in 2021, often highly potent stimulants like Adderall and Ritalin.
Well, I'm not giving my baby any more dangerous drugs. From now on, it's nothing but fresh air, lots of hugs, and good old-fashioned Ritalin.
You said a mouthful. When I can't stop fiddling, I just takes me Ritalin. I'm popping and sailing, man.
This raises big questions. Are we getting better at recognising ADHD, or are we overdiagnosing and overmedicating kids? Is ADHD truly more common, or are children being misdiagnosed for other issues like stress, diet, or screen time?
Working with the psychiatric industry, Big Pharma has, over time, medicalized the entire human condition, every thought, emotion, feeling, prescribed a drug to treat it, as though a feeling or thought or mental disposition is automatically diseased just because it happens to be unpleasant or inconvenient.
So what's really going on? Does Matt Walsh have a point? There's clearly a divide in some opinions. Some argue ADHD is overdiagnosed and driven by Big Pharma. Others believe it's still underdiagnosed and that people suffer when they don't get proper treatment. So let's get on to the major question. Why has ADHD exploded in recent years? That's what I think we really need to focus on here. There's no doubt that ADHD is being diagnosed at staggering rates. Some argue that it's simply better awareness and recognition of ADHD. Others, like Matt Walsh, think it's something much more cynical. Are we over-medicalising childhood? Are we slapping a label on normal kids who struggle to sit still? Or is there a legitimate rise in attention-related issues? Some say that ADHD is on the rise because we're finally recognising and diagnosing something that's always been there. But not everyone agrees. At this point, I know what some of you are probably thinking. Let's just say in the past few years from 2020, children's lives have been completely turned upside down. Routines were shattered, social interaction was limited, screen time rocketed. And stress on parents, teachers and kids was at an all-time high. You know what I'm talking about. Now we're seeing a surge in ADHD diagnoses. Could there be a connection? Now, I can't talk about the elephant in the room on this channel because it's just not quite acceptable yet. But what I can say is this. When we radically change how children live, learn, and interact with the world, it shouldn't surprise us when their behaviour changes too. So with that being said, let's have a look at some of the other biggest factors contributing to this rise. The first issue we have to tackle is whether ADHD is being misdiagnosed. Dr Josef Witt-Doerring actually agrees that overdiagnosis is a real problem. Like he said earlier, psychiatric medications were originally used for severe conditions, but now even children with mild inattention are being prescribed stimulants. And then there's the age-related misdiagnosis, a huge issue. Research has shown that children who are the youngest in their kindergarten classes are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, probably simply because they're developmentally less mature than their older classmates. That's not a disorder. That's just being 4 instead of 5. Even Dr. Gabor Maté, who believes ADHD is real, argues that many of these kids aren't suffering from a disease at all. They're reacting to their environment.
Most of the problems that people are troubled with are actually problems of development. What are the conditions in this society that lead so many people to have a failure or a slowing down of the impulse regulation? So it's a developmental problem rather than a medical problem per se.
One of the biggest concerns is that many children aren't being thoroughly evaluated before being diagnosed with ADHD. ADHD symptoms overlap with many other issues: sleep deprivation, anxiety, trauma, sensory issues, and even a poor diet. Some kids may simply have a different learning style, but are quickly given an ADHD label. But if ADHD symptoms can mimic so many other issues, how much of what we're seeing is really ADHD, and how much is a reflection on the world we're raising kids in? Matt Walsh points to a cultural shift. Our obsessions with screens, social media, and instant gratification are a major contributor to attention issues.
Have you tried drastically reducing his screen time? I mean, cutting it down to 30 minutes a day from the hours a day he's probably currently getting. Have you tried cutting down your own screen time and using that time to interact with your child, play games with him, give him something enjoyable and wholesome and constructive to focus on?
He's not the only one who thinks this. Dr. Hyman calls modern society an ADHD culture, where we're all being conditioned for shorter attention spans through constant digital stimulation. He argues that many kids diagnosed with ADHD are actually just victims of an environment that overwhelms their developing brains. Studies have found that increased screen time is linked to higher ADHD symptoms. Children who spend more time outdoors in unstructured play have fewer attention issues. Social media's rapid dopamine hits mimic the same neurological pathways affected in ADHD. If we take a child, expose them to overstimulating content from an early age, and then expect them to sit still and focus in a dull classroom for hours, is it any surprise that they struggle? ADHD's diagnoses skyrocketed after the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act in the US, when schools became hyper-focused on standardized testing. Teachers suddenly had a huge incentive to identify struggling kids because a mental health diagnosis meant extra funding for the school, special accommodations to boost test scores, medical justification for disruptive behaviour. It's apparent that ADHD rates were higher in the states where more funding is tied to disability diagnoses. Matt Walsh argues that school environments exacerbate or even create the conditions leading to ADHD diagnosis. Schools favour quiet, compliant students, but that's not how all kids learn best. And there's this too. Children diagnosed with ADHD are overwhelmingly boys. In general, boys have more energy, impulsivity, and physicality. But in today's school system, that's a problem. Girls may be underdiagnosed because they often show internalizing symptoms like inattentiveness, which may be perceived as dreaminess rather than hyperactivity. Are we medicating normal male or child behaviour because it's inconvenient? That is what we really need to ask.
If there's something he can focus on and pay attention to, but he struggles to pay attention in school, the problem is obviously not a physical inability to pay attention. The problem is that he's bored in school.
Here's where it gets controversial. Is ADHD being used as a crutch for poor parenting? Well, some psychiatrists push back against this, pointing out that ADHD is highly heritable. If a child has it, there's a good chance one of their parents does too. But on the flip side, studies show that children with highly stressed, inattentive, or uninvolved parents have higher rates of ADHD symptoms. Dr. Gabor Maté, who believes ADHD symptoms are real but not part of a disorder, goes further. He thinks it's actually an attachment issue, a response to early adversity rather than a medical condition. Essentially, Maté argues that ADHD isn't something a child is born with, but rather a response to their environment, especially if they're growing up in a home filled with stress, emotional neglect, or parental inconsistency. This aligns with research showing that children who experience early trauma or neglect or high parental stress are more likely to develop ADHD-like symptoms. But is that really ADHD? Or is it a child responding to their circumstances? Dr. Russell Barkley, a leading ADHD researcher, completely rejects this idea. He has blasted Gabor Maté's theory, arguing that there's a strong genetic link.
Both reviews of the literature as well as very large twin studies tell us that parenting is not a factor that is influential in the cause of ADHD. Now, don't get me wrong, parenting matters. We know that there are shared environmental contributions, including parenting, to disorders that are comorbid with ADHD, such as oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, and even to a lesser extent, possibly to depression and anxiety. Though they have genetic components to them, they are nowhere near as genetically determined or influenced as is ADHD. So let's understand, parenting matters, but not in the cause of ADHD.
Barkley's research is based on genetic twin studies, which consistently show that ADHD is one of the most heritable psychiatric conditions, with up to 80% genetic influence. Barkley also points out that if ADHD were purely environmental, we'd see massive differences in ADHD prevalence across cultures, but we don't. ADHD exists in every country, including those with very different parenting styles.
No, parenting does not cause ADHD. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder primarily caused by genetics.
But here's where things get really tricky. Even if we accept that parenting doesn't cause ADHD, it's fair to say that to some degree, children with ADHD are harder to parent. Dr. Josef acknowledges that parenting plays a role, but doesn't fully cause ADHD. Instead, he suggests that raising a child with ADHD is uniquely challenging, which can lead to higher parental stress and more reactive parenting, a cycle that exacerbates symptoms rather than creates them. In other words, it's a two-way street. ADHD may not be caused by bad parenting, but children with ADHD are more likely to experience negative parenting because they are more difficult to manage, in general, sometimes. So what can this mean? Well, parents of kids with ADHD often struggle more, leading to harsher discipline, frustration, and inconsistent parenting. I'm not saying that parents of kids with ADHD are bad parents. Nor am I saying that this is every parent of every ADHD child. This is just generally what comes up in the research. I think we can all agree that children with ADHD need structured parenting, not just punishment or medication. But could some of these struggles be eased by addressing the basics, things like diet, movement, and overall physical health? Now, at this point, I know we need to talk about Big Pharma, and I will get to that in a minute. But before I do, I think we really should be asking, are kids' brains struggling because their bodies are struggling? We've completely transformed childhood. Ultra-processed foods, less movement, more screen time, rising pollution, and skyrocketing stress. And now ADHD diagnoses are soaring. Is that really just a coincidence? Could what kids eat, how much they move, and what they're exposed to be fueling ADHD symptoms? Food dyes, preservatives, and sugar have been linked to hyperactivity. A significant study by researchers at the University of Southampton found evidence of increased hyperactivity in young children eating a mixture of certain artificial food colours and the preservative sodium benzoate. The Fenigold diet, which removes artificial colours and additives, has shown improvements in some children, but the reviews of this diet aren't completely conclusive. Deficiencies in magnesium, omega-3 and zinc are common in kids diagnosed with ADHD, with research showing that supplementing these nutrients can improve focus and impulse control, but only if the child is truly deficient. Many studies have shown that kids who exercise regularly have fewer attention problems. Yet today's children move less than ever, spending hours indoors on screens instead. Dr. Hyman advocates for addressing underlying causes rather than solely relying on medication. He argues that ADHD is often a result of poor nutrition, inflammation, and metabolic issues. Environmental toxins matter too. Studies have found that lead exposure, air pollution, and even prenatal stress can contribute to ADHD-like symptoms. So, for example, air pollution research has shown that exposure to fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, can increase the risk of developing ADHD. A study in Vancouver showed that children with higher exposure to PM 2.5 had up to 62% increased risk of ADHD. Prenatal exposure to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, a component of air pollution, was associated with a 5-fold increase in ADHD symptoms at age 9. So if we've changed how kids eat, how much they move, what they breathe, and how much stress they absorb from their parents, is it really shocking that their brains are struggling? Okay, of course, we have to talk about the money. This is where things get, well, you make up your mind. If you watched my video about baby formula, you'll know that following the money always yields answers and more questions. The surge in ADHD diagnosis has significantly impacted the pharmaceutical industry, unsurprisingly. Major pharmaceutical companies have capitalized on this trend, leading to substantial financial gains. ADHD medication is a $14.3 billion industry, one of the most profitable sectors in US pharmaceuticals. Prescriptions for ADHD medications have increased significantly. Adderall prescriptions reached 41.2 million in October 2022, a 16% increase over the previous year. The cost of the NHS in the UK, my home country, of CNS stimulants and ADHD medicines was £104 million in 2022-23, with half of this spent on methylphenidate, £52 million, and £33 million on lisdexamfetamine. The APA, which stands for the American Psychiatric Association, receives 20 to 30% of its funding from drug companies. CHADD, a major ADHD advocacy group, has received over $1 million from pharmaceutical companies. The FDA is responsible for approving ADHD medications, which involves reviewing clinical trials conducted by pharmaceutical companies. However, these trials are often limited in scope and duration, with many drugs approved after studying fewer than 300 participants for less than 6 months. Now, I could make a whole video about drug research in relation to ADHD meds for kids. It is quite a rabbit hole, so let me know in the comments if you want me to dig deeper into this. While not specific to ADHD medications, the FDA receives significant funding from pharmaceutical companies through user fees. In fiscal year 2022, these fees accounted for 46% of the FDA's total budget. Several pharmaceutical giants dominate the ADHD medication market. Shire Pharmaceuticals. Known for producing Vivans, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Shire reported sales of $2.1 billion for this medication in a single year. Johnson & Johnson. Their ADHD medication, Concerta, generated $134 million in sales in 2024, despite facing generic competition. Novartis. Producer of Ritalin, Novartis has maintained a significant presence in the ADHD medication market. The broader methylphenidate market, which includes Ritalin, was valued at approximately $9.6 billion in 2023 and is projected to reach $13.6 billion by 2034. The overall ADHD medication market was valued at $14.3 billion in 2023 and is projected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 3.7% from 2024 to 2030. And guess what? The criteria for ADHD diagnosis has expanded and may continue to expand over time. Think about it. Kids with ADHD are very likely to be medicated. Adderall is chemically similar to methamphetamine, and prescription stimulant abuse is rising among teenagers. The long-term effects of ADHD medication use are still being studied. But there are concerns about dependency and overuse. So is ADHD really exploding, or is Big Pharma making sure that it does? The recent appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a Secretary for the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, in February of this year, has introduced a new dimension to this issue. Kennedy, known for his skepticism towards certain medical practices, has expressed concerns about the overprescription of psychiatric medications, including those for ADHD. Shortly after his confirmation, President Trump issued an executive order establishing the Make America Healthy Again, MAHA Commission, led by Kennedy. This commission is tasked with assessing various health threats, including the potential overutilization of medications prescribed for conditions like ADHD in children. Kennedy's stance has generated anxiety among patients and healthcare providers who rely on ADHD medications. There is concern that his policies could lead to reduced access to these drugs. But I am all for transparency when it comes to medicines. As I've said many times before, I am a firm believer in fully informed, uncoerced consent, and I'm going to keep saying it unapologetically. Don't we all want to know what the real effects of these drugs are on our kids? If the long-term studies are, well, for want of a better word, insufficient, surely investigating these drugs can only provide more clarity. If these medications are truly safe and appropriate, then proper scrutiny should only reinforce that. But if there are any risks we haven't fully acknowledged, shouldn't parents have the right to know? Transparency isn't about banning medication. It's about making sure families have all the facts before making life-altering decisions for their children. So where does this leave us? Clearly, there's more to ADHD than meets the eye. Our modern world is playing a role, but the question is, what should we do about it? What's the balance? For some children, medication may be life-changing, but for others, are we medicating behaviours that could be managed other ways? The next part of this video is crucial if you're the parent of a child who has a hyperactive nature. Of course, I'm always going to be advising you to seek professional, individualised advice, but these tips may just help too. So if ADHD is real, but possibly overdiagnosed, how can we help kids thrive without immediately resorting to medication? Well, the good news is that there's plenty of evidence-based strategies that can help support kids with ADHD symptoms, and some of them might be even more effective in the long run. Let's start with food, because what we put into our bodies directly affects how our brains function. Dr. Mark Hyman, a functional medicine doctor, points out on his website, inflammation has been linked to almost all brain problems, such as autism, ADHD, Alzheimer's, and depression. Research has linked poor nutrition to worsening ADHD symptoms. Some key points. Artificial food dyes and preservatives have been shown to increase hyperactivity in some children. Deficiencies in omega-3, fatty acids, magnesium, iron, and zinc have been associated with attention issues. Blood sugar spikes and crashes from sugary processed foods can cause mood swings and impulsivity. One thing to do is try reducing processed foods and increasing protein, healthy fats, and whole foods. Omega-3 supplements alone have been shown to improve focus. It's no coincidence that the rise in ADHD has paralleled a decline in physical activity. Kids are sitting in classrooms for longer hours than ever before. Break time has been cut down in many schools, and in the evenings, screens have replaced outdoor, unstructured play. Yet research shows that exercise increases dopamine and norepinephrine levels, just like ADHD medications. Even short bursts of physical activity before school can improve attention and impulse control. Fidgeting, which many ADHD kids naturally do, helps regulate focus, which is why standing desks and movement breaks are so effective. So if your child struggles to sit still, don't fight it. Work with it. Encourage movement breaks, use fidget tools, and consider activities like martial arts, swimming, or gymnastics, which is great for focus and coordination. About 70% of children with ADHD have mild to severe sleep problems, things like insomnia, sleep apnea, and restless leg syndrome. Lack of sleep can mimic every ADHD symptom: inattention, irritability, impulsivity, and emotional outbursts. One thing parents can do is prioritize sleep hygiene, consistent bedtime routines, no screens before bed, and even checking for underlying sleep issues like mouth breathing or snoring. As a parenting coach, I teach parents to build on the idea that kids need structure, boundaries, and emotional support. Instead of asking, "How do I control my kid's behaviour?" ask, "How can I help my child learn self-regulation?" Key strategies that make a huge difference are clear and consistent routines. Predictability helps ADHD brains function better. Calm, firm, but warm parenting. Low stress environments help kids self-regulate. Helping kids identify their triggers and regulate emotions instead of reacting impulsively. At the core of this entire debate is one question: are we doing what's best for our children? If ADHD diagnoses are truly skyrocketing, we need to ask why. Is it due to environmental factors, social changes, a genuine increase in neurodevelopmental differences? Or is there something more troubling at play? A system that benefits financially from labelling children. Pharmaceutical companies make billions from ADHD medication. If they are prioritising their profits over children's well-being, we deserve to know. We've seen time and time again that Big Pharma is not beyond putting profit before people, and now the stakes are even higher because we're talking about children. So what's the alternative? Well, if ADHD is, in some cases, just a different way of thinking, do we even need to treat it at all? If lifestyle changes, dietary interventions, and structural support in schools can make a difference, why is medication so often the first-line solution? Why do parents feel forced to seek a diagnosis just to get their child the help they need? And most importantly, is this rapid increase in ADHD diagnoses truly about helping children, or is it about something else entirely? Trust in the pharmaceutical industry is at an all-time low, and to be honest, for good reason. People are waking up to how deeply these corporations influence research, policy, and even public perception. No company, no industry, and no government should be allowed to put their profits ahead of children's health. With RFK Jr now stepping into a key role in health policy, there's potential for real scrutiny on these issues. But whether you support him or not, this should be a bipartisan concern. Everyone should be asking, are we making the right choices for our kids? At the end of the day, the way we handle ADHD in society is where the real debate lies. So whether you agree with Matt Walsh, who says it's down to bad parenting, or Gabor Maté, who says it's an emotional response to childhood stress, Russell Barkley, who believes ADHD to be genetic, or any other expert opinion, what matters is whether we as parents, educators, and society are asking the right questions. And if you know me by now, you know that I love to ask questions. Are kids being labelled when they really just need better sleep, nutrition, and movement? Are we pathologising normal childhood behaviour? Should medication be the first line of treatment? Do we need to go back to the drawing board when establishing diagnoses? Or are there genuine cases where ADHD support is life-changing? Now tell me what you think. Is ADHD overdiagnosed? Are we approaching this issue the wrong way? Drop me a comment below, let's talk, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content like this.